I need to tell you something. I've never told anyone outside of my closest friends. And even then, I only told Margaret the full version, because she's the only one who wouldn't immediately tell me to let it go. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 64 years old. I live in a semi-detached house in Burlington, Ontario, about 40 minutes outside Toronto, and until about 8 months ago, I thought I was going to spend the rest of my retirement watching my family grow. Grandchildren. Maybe. Sunday dinners. The kind of life you imagine when you're younger and you think, well, if I just work hard enough and love generously enough, things will turn out the way they're supposed to. I was wrong about that. But I was also wrong about something else. I was wrong about how the story would end. Let me start at the beginning. My husband, Gerald, passed away 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning, I held his hand in the palliative ward at Joseph Brant Hospital. 14 weeks is nothing. It's a season. It's not enough time to say everything you need to say to a person you've loved for 31 years. And I'm here to tell you that it never will be, no matter how much time you're given. There's always one more thing you meant to say. Gerald and I had one son. Our boy, Thomas Gerald Callahan, named after his father because Gerald insisted and I was too tired from 31 hours of labor to argue with him about anything. Thomas is, a good man mostly. He has his father's jaw and his father's stubbornness, which when Gerald had it I found endearing, and when Thomas has it I find exhausting. But I love him. I love him in that particular painful way that mothers love adult sons. From a distance that you didn't choose, across a space that appeared gradually without either of you quite noticing. Thomas met Claire Beaumont at a work conference in Vancouver. She's from Kelowna originally, though she'd been living in Toronto for about 3 years when they met. She works in marketing. Digital marketing, she always clarified, as if the word digital elevated it considerably. And when Thomas first brought her home for Thanksgiving, she was perfectly lovely. Polished. The kind of woman who brought a very expensive bottle of wine and complimented my kitchen backsplash in a way that felt rehearsed but not unpleasantly so. I remember thinking, she's trying. That counts for something. I tried too. I really did. The first sign, and I'm going to be honest with myself, because there's no point in telling this story otherwise. The first sign came about 4 months into their relationship. Thomas mentioned that Claire had suggested they spend Christmas in Kelowna with her parents, the Beaumonts, Richard and Pamela Beaumont. I said, of course, that's completely reasonable. You should go. What I didn't say was, it's the first Christmas without your father, and I was hoping. I made my own Christmas dinner that year. Just me and Margaret, who came over with a bottle of Bailey's and a grocery store pie. And honestly, it was fine. We watched old movies, and she told me the same story about her ex-husband that she's been telling me for 9 years, and I laughed in all the right places. But something shifted in me that Christmas. Not dramatically. Just shifted. Over the next 2 years, I watched Thomas and Claire build their life together, and I watched myself slowly become a figure in the margins of it. Not excluded, exactly. Never anything so overt that I could point to it and say, there, that's the thing. It was subtler than that. It was the group texts that I was added to after decisions had already been made. The dinners I was invited to at restaurants that were a 45-minute drive for me, and 5 minutes for them, always on weeknights, always short notice. The way Claire spoke to me with a particular kind of patient politeness, the way you speak to someone you've decided is slightly less sharp than you, slightly behind the times, slightly to be managed rather than engaged. I'm not an easy woman to dismiss. Gerald always said I had too much going on behind my eyes for people to feel comfortable ignoring me entirely. But Claire was very good at it. When Thomas proposed to her, at Niagara-on-the-Lake, he told me, very romantic, the whole thing planned down to the minute. He called me afterward. Not before. After. I found that out when I mentioned to Margaret that I'd known about the ring for a month, that Thomas had asked me if I thought Claire would say yes. Margaret looked at me very carefully and said, Dorothy, did he actually ask you about the ring, or did he ask you something vaguer than that? And I realized he'd asked me if I thought Claire was the kind of person who appreciated traditional gestures, which is not the same question at all. I said yes anyway, to whatever question he'd actually been asking. The wedding was planned for the following September. A Saturday, which is the right day for a wedding. The venue was a restored heritage property about 20 minutes east of the city. Beautiful old stonework, gardens, the kind of place that photographs extraordinarily well and costs accordingly. Thomas told me the budget and I didn't flinch, which required some effort. I want to explain what I was planning, because this is important. Gerald and I had bought our house in Burlington in 1991 for $187,000. When the market did what it did over the following decades, and particularly after Gerald passed, and I started thinking seriously about what I was going to do with the asset I was sitting on, I had it appraised. I won't give you the number, because frankly it still makes me slightly dizzy. But let's say it was considerably more than $187,000. I'd also been careful. Gerald and I both were, with his pension, with my own savings from 30 years of working in hospital administration, with the small inheritance from Gerald's mother that we'd put into a GIC and never touched. What I'm telling you is that I had something to give. And I wanted to give it. Not to be generous in an abstract sense, but because I genuinely believed, or I wanted to believe, that if I could give Thomas and Claire a solid foundation, a real one, the kind that takes most couples 15 years to build in this market, then maybe we could start fresh. Maybe the distance I'd been feeling was just the ordinary friction of a new relationship finding its shape. And if I came to them with something real, something that said, I am here and I am not going anywhere, and I want you both to flourish, maybe that would matter. I decided to give them property. Not my house. I wasn't ready to leave Burlington, and it wouldn't have been right anyway. But Gerald's brother, my brother-in-law Keith, had owned a small investment property in Hamilton. A 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street that he'd rented out for years. When Keith moved to Nova Scotia to be near his daughter, he sold it to me for well under market value. Family price, he said. Gerald would have wanted you to have something like this. I'd been renting it out since. It was in good shape. The tenants had been there for 3 years. Nice couple, always paid on time. I'd had a property lawyer, my friend Susan Park, who'd done Gerald's estate, update the title. I'd had the place inspected. I'd bought out the tenant's lease early, very fairly, with 3 months' notice and a generous relocation amount, because I didn't want anyone hurt by what I was doing. The property in Hamilton by that point was worth just over $480,000. I put the deed, and a letter from Susan confirming the title transfer, and a handwritten note from me to both of them, inside a plain cream envelope. The note said, "This is your foundation. Build something beautiful. I love you both. Dorothy." I sealed it, and I kept it on my kitchen table for 2 weeks before the wedding, just looking at it, sometimes in the morning, over my coffee. Wondering if I was doing the right thing. Wondering if it would change anything. Margaret, when I told her what was in the envelope, went very quiet and then said, "Dorothy, are you sure?" And I said, I was sure. And she looked at me with that particular expression she has, which means she has concerns, but loves me too much to press them. She should have pressed them. The wedding itself was on a Saturday in mid-September. The kind of day that makes you understand why Ontario autumn inspires such loyalty. Clear sky, warm enough for the outdoor ceremony, leaves just beginning to turn on the old maples along the property's laneway. It was genuinely beautiful. I will give them that. I arrived at the venue about 40 minutes before the ceremony. Thomas had texted me the previous night to confirm the time, which I appreciated. What he hadn't mentioned was the seating arrangement. There was a front row on the left side, the family side, with a reserved section for the Beaumonts. Richard and Pamela and Claire's 2 sisters and their husbands and 4 children between them. The reserved section took up 2 full rows. I was in the 3rd row, not reserved, not labeled, just a seat that the coordinator pointed me to when I arrived, and stood there, holding my envelope and looking at the arrangement and not quite understanding what I was seeing. I asked, very quietly, if there had been a mix-up. The coordinator checked her clipboard and said no. This was the arrangement as filed. I nodded. I said thank you. I found my seat. For the record, I am the only parent Thomas has. Gerald is gone. There is no one else. I sat in the 3rd row, and watched my son marry a woman from the second row because that's where I'd been put. The ceremony was lovely. I cried at the right moments. I clapped when they were announced. I kept my face very still during the photographs. At the reception, I was seated at a table with Thomas's colleagues from work. All perfectly nice people, not family. I was at the work colleagues' table. The Beaumont family. Richard and Pamela, the sisters, the children, were at the head table adjacent to the wedding party. I was with people I'd met twice. I didn't make a scene. I want you to understand that. I am 64 years old, and I have been through things that would unbend most people. And I do not make scenes. I had my dinner. I danced once with Thomas, and I held it together completely. And I smiled at Claire across the room, and she smiled back, and it was absolutely fine. What was not fine was happening underneath all of it, in that quiet place where you process things you don't yet have words for. After dinner, during the gift opening, which at this particular venue was done tableside, a coordinator bringing gifts to where the couple sat, I waited. I'd brought the envelope in my bag. When the coordinator came to our section, I passed it forward, and it eventually made its way to the table where Thomas and Claire were sitting with the Beaumonts, and a few of Claire's close friends. I watched Claire's face when she received it. She held the plain cream envelope in both hands, and I could see. From my seat at the work colleagues' table, I could see very clearly the slight change in her expression. The envelope was not elaborate. It was not decorated. It was not in a gift bag with tissue paper. It was an envelope, the kind you'd put a card in, and it was sealed with nothing but the flap. She set it aside. Not opened. Set aside. She put it on the small table beside her and turned to the next gift. I thought, she's saving the cards for later. That's reasonable. Some people do that. But then the evening continued, and the gifts were moved to a cart, and I saw the coordinator gathering items, and at some point in the activity of it all, I saw the envelope slide off the edge of the table and drift to the floor. No one picked it up. I told myself I was watching too closely. I told myself it would be found. I stayed at my table, and I spoke with Thomas's colleague David and his wife about their recent trip to Prince Edward Island, and I kept the conversation going. Because if I stopped the conversation, I would have to think about the envelope on the floor. Near the end of the evening, when the tables were being cleared and guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, I saw a staff member collecting items from under and around the gift table. Napkins, a program, a child's dropped toy, and the envelope. I watched him deposit it in a black waste bag. I stood up so fast that David's wife said, "Dorothy, are you all right?" I said I was fine. I said I'd forgotten something. I walked over to the staff member, a young man, maybe 20, completely confused by the older woman bearing down on him with an expression he probably couldn't quite classify, and I said, "Excuse me." There was an envelope there, a cream-colored one, plain, and he reached into the bag without any fuss and handed it back to me. It was still sealed. I held it in my hand, and I stood in the middle of that beautiful reception hall with the lights low and the music still playing, and my son dancing with his new wife across the room. And I thought about Gerald, and about the house in Burlington, and about the bungalow in Hamilton that I'd spent 4 months and considerable money preparing to give away. I put the envelope in my bag. I said my goodbyes. I hugged Thomas, and I told him I loved him, and I told Claire she looked beautiful, which was true. Richard and Pamela Beaumont shook my hand and told me it was a wonderful evening, and I agreed with them. I got in my car and I drove home to Burlington on the QEW with the radio off, and I sat in my driveway about 10 minutes before I went inside. Margaret called the next morning. I told her what had happened, all of it. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Claire went to Portugal for their honeymoon. 2 weeks. And when they came back, life resumed the way it does. Thomas called occasionally. Claire texted once to say they were back safely, and the trip had been wonderful, and included a photo of a coastal view. No thank you for the evening. No mention of any envelope. No curiosity at all about whether I'd brought them something beyond the card that presumably hadn't existed, because there was no card. There was never a card. There was only the deed to a $480,000 property that was now sitting in my kitchen drawer. About 6 weeks after the wedding, Thomas called on a Sunday afternoon. We talked about ordinary things for a while. His work, how I was managing the yard going into autumn, whether I was planning to visit my sister in Fredericton. Then he said, "Mum, I wanted to ask you something." I said, "Of course." He said, "We've been looking at the Hamilton market. Claire has some contacts there through work. We're thinking it might be a good time to get into property in that area. And I know you had the rental property there. And," he paused, "I guess I was wondering if you'd ever thought about what you were planning to do with it eventually." And there it was. I was very calm. I said, "What do you mean?" "Thomas," he said, "I just mean, in terms of your estate planning, we thought maybe it was worth a conversation. Claire thinks the Hamilton market has a lot of room to grow, and she's done some research, and we thought you might want to know that if you were ever considering." He trailed off. Then he said, "I mean, we're not expecting anything, obviously. It's just a conversation." I said, "Thomas, I need to tell you something." I told him about the envelope. I told him what was in it. I told him I'd had Susan Park prepare the transfer documents. I told him about the property inspection, about the tenants I'd bought out, about the work I'd put into making it ready to give them free and clear, and with no conditions attached. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that I thought maybe we'd lost the connection. Then Thomas said, very quietly, "Mum, what happened to the envelope?" And I told him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he needed to talk to Claire. He said he'd call me back. He called back 3 hours later. Claire, he said, had no memory of seeing a plain envelope that evening. She thought perhaps it had been mixed up with the venue's materials. She was, his words, very upset that this had happened. "Thomas." She held it in her hands. I was watching. He said, "Mum, it was a very busy night." I said, "I know that." He said, "So what happens now?" I said, "I've been thinking about that," and I had been. For 6 weeks I had been sitting with it, turning it over, looking at it from every angle. I thought about what Gerald would have said. I thought about what it meant that Thomas's first instinct, when he heard what had been in that envelope, was to call Claire before calling me back. I thought about the third row. I thought about the work colleagues' table. I thought about the coordinator's clipboard. I thought about the Hamilton property, and what else it could be. I said, "The property is no longer available." Thomas went quiet again. I said, "I've been in touch with Susan Park. I'm keeping the property in my name for now, and I've entered into an agreement with a local nonprofit that provides transitional housing for women leaving domestic situations. They're going to lease it at a significantly reduced rate. Susan helped me set up the structure so that the rental income flows into a small foundation. Gerald's name on it, the Callahan Foundation. It's nothing elaborate, but it's something." Thomas said, "Mum." I said, "I know." He said, He stopped. Then he said, "That's actually really wonderful." I said, "I thought so too." There was a long pause. He said very carefully that he thought maybe he and Claire should come for dinner, that maybe the 3 of us needed to sit down and talk properly. I said I agreed. I said Sunday in 2 weeks worked for me, and I'd make the roast chicken with the potatoes, the way he liked. He said that sounded good. Claire, when they came, was not the same as she'd been before. I don't know exactly what Thomas said to her, and I'm not sure I want to, but she sat at my kitchen table and she said, "Dorothy, I want to apologize to you. I know that what I didn't do, was wrong. I don't have a good excuse." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Claire, I'm not looking for an apology. What I'm looking for is a relationship. A real one, with both of you." She nodded. She looked, for the first time in the 2 years I'd known her, genuinely uncertain, not performing, not polished, just sitting there, uncertain, in my kitchen. I poured her more tea. "I won't tell you everything is resolved, because that's not how real things work. Thomas and Claire and I are still finding our footing. Some Sundays are easier than others. Claire is trying in ways she wasn't trying before, and I notice the effort, and I tell her when I notice it because I think that matters. We are all, I suppose, doing the awkward work of deciding what kind of family we want to be. The Hamilton property has its first 3 residents now, 3 women, and, between them, 5 children. Susan Park sent me photos of the day they moved in. The foundation had done a small welcome, nothing elaborate, and I put one of them on my refrigerator next to the one of Thomas at his convocation. and the one of Gerald and me at Lake Louise the summer before he got sick. I think Gerald would have liked knowing what the money went toward. I think he would have liked the name on it too. The deed is still in my kitchen drawer. I open it sometimes, not for any particular reason, just to look at it, just to remember what it almost was us and what it became instead. Some gifts, I've decided, belong to you until the right moment. And sometimes the right moment turns out to be something you could never have planned for. Something that asks more of you than generosity ever did, and gives back more than you expected. Not in the form you imagined, but in the form you actually needed. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What time is it there? I'd love to know who's out there, listening to this, on the other side of whatever evening they're having. And if you've ever held something in your hands that you almost gave away, I'd love to hear about that too.